Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Iran nuclear deal talks appear frozen, and as US midterm elections are coming up, the Biden administration is busy pouring fuel onto the Ukrainian fire and provoking China with belligerent statements, but still seems intent on extracting itself from its Middle Eastern presence, relying on so-called over-the-horizon capabilities, meaning flying death robots or drones. And yet the talks to restore the JCPOA have stalled. It's reached the point where prominent US allies such as former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt and former EU Foreign Policy Chief Javier Solana accuse Biden of passivity vis-a-vis Iran in the Washington Post this week. It's puzzling, they wrote, that after running on a return to the nuclear deal and promising that America is back, Biden has been slow-walking diplomacy that US allies strongly support. Enrique Mora, the European Union's coordinator for Iran nuclear deal negotiations, who recently visited Iran to help reach a deal, also shared on Twitter the Bildt and Solana article, which warned that we may find ourselves in another conflict that no one asked for. The French Foreign Ministry has also publicly complained that the draft agreement has been ready for 2 months. To help understand why attempts to salvage an agreement have not succeeded, as well as to catch up on regional events, I'm joined by Mohammad Marandi, professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Mohammad, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I should also add that you were, during the talks in Vienna, you were the international media advisor to the negotiating team, the Iranian negotiating team, just to throw that in there. But I guess let's get right into it. Where do things stand now, and why is there no agreement?
Well, there are a number of differences that continue to exist. We have to keep in mind that it was the Americans that left the deal under Trump. And before Trump left the deal, it was the Americans under Obama and Trump that were violating the deal. So the Iranians were in full compliance from day one. The Americans were not. Obama was in violation of the deal in that he prevented Iran from accessing the international financial system. And the agreement says, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, says specifically that the Americans should not only stop hindering the normalization of Iranian trade, but the United States has a responsibility to facilitate the normalization of Iranian trade. But behind the scenes, Obama was telling banks through the Treasury, financial institutions, insurance companies, shipping companies, and oil companies, energy companies, not to do business with Iran, or else. So while the Iranians were implementing the deal in good faith, the Americans weren't. And then, of course, Trump tore up the deal. This is where things stood when the negotiations began. Because Biden, he was criticizing Trump for leaving the deal. But then when he became president, he basically implemented Trump's policies. Mm-hmm. And that is a continuation of maximum pressure. And also, I should add that when Trump tore up the deal, the Iranians continued to implement the deal in full, even though the Europeans and the Americans were all violating every single commitment. Every single commitment that they had, they ignored, and they imposed maximum pressure sanctions. So the Iranians, in order to show that they had good faith, they continued to fully implement the deal, even under maximum pressure sanctions. And after a full year of full implementation, they began to decrease their commitments in stages. Every 2 months, they would stop implementing parts of the deal to put pressure on the Europeans, because the Europeans promised the Iranians all sorts of things and they did nothing, even though the Iranians knew that the Europeans were lying. But they still said, okay, we'll wait. So the decreased implementation, the process of decreasing implementation during the second year took a full year. So it was after 2 years that the Iranians ended most of their commitments. And then it was only after Biden became president that the Iranians discontinued all of their commitments. So I'm saying this because I want your viewers to know who is the problem. So for decades, the Iranians were accused of building a nuclear weapon. And it was always, since the early 1990s, it was always a few months away, sort of like an oasis. Walk towards the oasis, and there it is, the Iranian nuclear weapon, right, straight ahead, and then you go there and still desert, and then it's been like that for decades. So the Iranians and the Americans and the P4+1, because the Americans were gone, it used to be the P5+1, the Americans left, it was the P4+1. The Iranians said, we will not allow the Americans back at the negotiating table until they meet their obligations. So the Iranians in Vienna began negotiating with those who remained in the deal. The Germans, the French, the Russians, the Chinese, and the British. And of course, the European Union was there as well. So, and the Americans came and they were sitting in a building next door and in consultation with their allies and the Russians and the Chinese, now their adversaries, I suppose. But during the negotiations in Vienna, the Iranians said very clearly that we're willing to implement the deal, but the Americans have to implement the deal in full as well. And we will not allow the Americans to cheat us again like in the past. How did the Americans cheat the Iranians? Well, under Trump, the Americans tore up the deal. So this time around, the Iranians are saying, we need assurances. Right. That you don't just tear up the deal tomorrow. The second is, since Obama cheated Iran and he was in violation of the deal, major parts of the deal, the Iranians are saying, we need a verification process that both sides are implementing the deal. Because in 2015, there was a verification process for the Iranians. It was the IAEA. Whatever the Iranians did, the IAEA said, yes, the Iranians did that. And that was a sort of checklist. So they had people who'd come to Iran, but there was no verification process for the Americans. The Americans said, we'll normalize this, we'll normalize that, and they didn't do it. So the Iranians this time round said, you need a verification process as well. In order for us to do something, we have to have evidence that you're doing what you have to do as well. So these were two major additions to the JCPOA. It didn't change the nature of the JCPOA, but it protected. They were there to protect the JCPOA.
Right.
So the Iranians were adding protection. They
understandably. Yeah, understandably so. Yeah.
So the Iranians told the Americans, okay, you have to promise you won't leave the deal, right? And sorry, this is a long introduction, but I think it's necessary.
Important. Yeah.
The Iranians said to the Americans, okay, we need assurances. The Americans said, we can't give assurances for the next presidency.
Right.
So the Iranians said, okay, give us assurances for your own presidency. And the Americans said, we can't do that either. So this is the people who the Iranians are negotiating with. So Biden is basically telling the Iranians, well, if I leave, I leave.
Yeah.
And the Iranians say, well, we can't work that way. So at the negotiating table, the Iranians said, okay, then we will have to keep our facilities intact. We will have to have our capability to enrich uranium through advanced equipment, advanced centrifuges intact, or at least we should be able to reassemble them quickly. That's our leverage. Those are our assurances. You can't promise to protect the deal, then we need this as protection. So the Americans say, well, these are new centrifuges. And the Iranians say, well, you brought about hundreds of billions of dollars of damage to the Iranian economy. Either compensate for that, Either you pay us the hundreds of billions of dollars of damage that you caused, or we keep these assurances. This new technology was developed as a result of the United States leaving the deal.
Right.
And it was only brought about after the Iranians continued to implement the deal, well after the Americans left and the Europeans halted implementation. Ultimately, the Americans and the Europeans had to accept. So the Iranians agreed where these new, very advanced centrifuges, they would be removed, they would cease to enrich uranium, but Iran would be capable of bringing them back online swiftly if the Americans violated the deal, if the Europeans cheated the Iranians.
Right.
And then, of course, I don't want to get into the verification process. That what was agreed upon was that the Americans would have to do certain things, and then the Iranians would do certain things, and then so there was this sort of, there were 3 months of negotiations, so that history didn't repeat itself, so that the Americans couldn't cheat Iran Obama style or cheat Iran Trump style. And of course, Biden, by lying and continuing with Trump's policies of maximum pressure, where he targets women and children, killing ordinary people to get his way, that did not inspire confidence among Iranians. The Iranians were adamant that we have to have this protection. So I'll just add one more thing and then I'll respond to your question. And that is because it's an interesting fact. Remember, because I just want to show how the Western media and how Western think tanks and how Western governments are dishonest about the nature of Iran's nuclear program. As I said earlier, the Iranian nuclear program, this military, let's say, attempt to create a nuclear weapon, and I should point out that if Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, it would have had it years ago.
Right.
But this is, as I said, it's like an oasis. It's like a mirage, right? It's like a mirage where you see this oasis like ahead of you, and then you go forward and you see it's just a mirage. Mm-hmm. The closer you get to the oasis, like on these old 1960 movies where, people are stuck in the desert and they see an oasis, and it's like that since the 1990s. But even during these negotiations, because it's still fresh in people's minds, the Americans and the Europeans kept saying that time is running out. The Iranian nuclear program has reached a point where if we don't conclude the negotiations now, it's too late.
Right.
So they set these artificial deadlines and all that. This was just 2, 3, 4 months ago. Well, there are no negotiations taking place right now. And why aren't they worried about Iran's nuclear program? Because they were lying all along. They knew that Iran wasn't developing a nuclear weapon. So these deadlines that they were set, that they set 3 months ago, well, Iran is still doing R&D, research and development. Iran is developing its peaceful nuclear program, but suddenly they're not concerned anymore. Aren't we a threat to the world? Aren't we on the verge of building a nuclear weapon?
They're distracted with Ukraine. I don't know.
But they're lying. They were lying. They're lying now. They were just lying. They were lying. Their intelligence organizations knew that Iran had never been seeking a nuclear weapon.
They even say it. They even say it.
Yeah, exactly. So this, keeping all this in mind, now what are they saying? They're not saying Iran has reached that point of no return. Now they're saying the problem is Iran. Okay, well, with all this history, let's put a question mark over this. The problem is Iran. The Iranians are saying the Revolutionary Guards, the Iranians are demanding that the Revolutionary Guards be removed from the FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list of the United States.
Right.
Right? Nonsense. If the United States right now decides to remove the Revolutionary Guards, the whole of the Revolutionary Guards from the FTO right now, as we speak, there still won't be a deal. The reason is that the United States has not resolved key issues yet for the deal to be implemented.
Mm.
And for example, the Iranians are saying, what if the United States leaves the deal? What if Biden decides after signing the deal to quit the deal 6 months later? Let's say the Israelis carry out a false flag operation somewhere in Europe, and then they say the Revolutionary Guards wanted to murder these Israelis. And then you'll have this network of people who will be, providing evidence, informed sources, intelligence officers who can't be named. The standard procedure for creating a narrative. Who will all be saying, yes, there's evidence that the Iranians are behind it. And then Biden will be put under pressure, and then he'll have to leave the deal. Let's say, right? So the Iranians say, well, since Biden said he can't promise to implement the deal, the Iranians are saying, okay, let's say you leave the deal after 6 months. What do people who invest in Iran during those 6 months do? What happens to their investment? So let's say you're rich, you made a lot of money off your online show, and you want to build a petrochemical plant in Iran. So you want to invest $1 billion. Hopefully you'll hire me.
Yeah.
Let's say $500 million worth of equipment, and you hire people, and then suddenly Biden leaves.
Right.
So the Iranians saying, what happens to those people who've invested in Iran during that period when the United States
said it was okay? Yeah.
The Americans were saying, that's their tough luck.
Wow.
The Iranians said, no, that's not going to work.
Right. Why would no one would agree to that? No one would agree to that.
No one would invest in Iran.
Right. That too. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. If the Americans leave, then you can say, okay, after the date where they leave, then whatever. And then the Iranians will return to enriching uranium. But those who want to invest during those 6 months, during those 3 weeks, during those 8 months before the false flag operation or whatever,
yeah,
they need protection.
Right.
So they negotiated over this. I don't want to go into the details, but they haven't come to an agreement. The Americans have failed to give assurances to protect people who want to
basically it sounds to me like the Americans are just unwilling to make even the slightest concession. And actually concession is not even the right word, because these are just basic things that
that is what the deal was about.
They're basically refusing to abide by any of the agreement. They're saying, we'll re-enter this agreement, but we can arbitrarily just not abide by anything whenever we feel like it. That's the agreement the Americans want.
Yes, I want to buy your apartment, and then I say, well, you give me the keys, you give me, you sell it. If I feel like it, I'll pay.
And if I feel like letting you live in it, then I'll back off. But when I feel like, it's actually, nobody would agree to that. It's completely absurd. But I did want to ask you, where, in terms of the Europeans and the Qataris, what efforts have there been from them to try to help, or have there been?
No, Qatar doesn't have a role to play here.
Okay.
They never had a role. The Europeans, they want a deal. They need a deal badly. But the Europeans can't make their own decisions.
Right.
And I don't know if you know that when the European representative came to Iran a couple of weeks ago, when he returned at the airport in Berlin, I think, they took his cell phone away from him.
Really?
He tweeted this. Yes, whenever you want to show this, find his tweet, Mora.
Oh,
they held him at the airport.
Yeah,
I
remember this.
His colleagues, they separated them, and they took his cell phone in Europe. He's a high-ranking EU diplomat. Who would do that? Who's behind it? Why did this happen? Why did they make him so angry that he tweeted about it? So he obviously, and the Europeans want that, but whoever took his cell phone,
does not want it.
Yeah. But for that to happen, you would think that that would be the top news story across the world, but it just, so the Europeans want to deal, and the Europeans right now, behind closed doors, they accept Iran's position. And we were close to a deal, by the way. During the negotiations, a couple of people in the American team, they left the negotiating table. They quit the team because they felt that the Americans were conceding too much. Of course, conceding too much basically means accepting key issues that need to be resolved in order for the nuclear deal to be implemented.
Right.
And then the head of the team, the American side, he went to Congress, Robert Malley, and the Senate, and it didn't go down well. He faced a lot of criticism. And then after that, this was very, they got cold feet. So we were very close to a deal. During the last days that I was in Vienna, the feeling was that we were almost there. And the Americans and the Europeans, and then suddenly, everything seemed to be moving forward. We thought that the foreign ministers would be in Vienna for a signing ceremony within 2 or 3 days, and then suddenly it all stopped. So the Americans recognize where things stand. And history shows that it's the Americans that were lying about Iran's peaceful nuclear program.
Right.
Thus, the artificial red lines and deadlines, and then nothing. And then, of course, decades of, mirage, accusations. There it is. It's right ahead of us. This nuclear weapon. For decades, they were lying in the past. Then, when there was a deal in 2015, they violated the deal.
Mm-hmm.
Iran implemented the deal. It's all there.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. And I think important that you point out that the Europeans want a deal, but they're not in charge of their own policy. I think that speaks to the broader problem. I mean, whatever is happening right now.
In Ukraine.
Exactly. The Europeans, even though it actually impacts them directly and geographically, what's happening with Ukraine,
more than anyone else,
more than the Americans, that's for sure. Yeah,
more than the Russians.
It impacts them directly. It's in their neighborhood, yet they have like zero say. And even if they did have a say in their own policy, they might still make the same American decisions, but they've ultimately just handed over the decision-making capacity for everything to the Americans and are completely spineless. But I did want to ask you about this because, a few months ago, it seemed as though that it was Russia that was obstructing Russia that was obstructing a successful agreement. At least it's how it was being portrayed. This was around, I think, the time when the war in Ukraine had started. Has that issue been resolved?
Well, again, this is something that the Western media tries to, this an image that they're trying to create in order to hide the fact that it is the United States that's a problem. So, and they do that through their Persian media as well. BBC Persian, VOA Persian, Iran International, which is a Saudi outlet, and all these other Persian media outlets, and their cyber army that's based in Albania, in the NATO country. They have the MEK terrorist organization that killed 17,000 Iranians that fought for Saddam Hussein. They have thousands of them based in Albania carrying out cyber warfare, and of course doing other horrible things, working with Israelis to assassinate people and to carry out espionage. So NATO is basically at war with Iran through these terrorist organizations. But in any case, the media arm of the MEK, the cyber army and the Persian media, they create this image that the problem is Russia because they were trying to hide the fact that the problem is in Washington. So first they were saying it was Russia, and then when it came out that it was nonsense, then they said, it's the Revolutionary Guard. It always has to be something. It's just not the Americans.
Anybody but the Americans. Anybody but the Americans.
It can be anything but the Americans. So
exactly.
The Russians, when the war started and the sanctions began, they said that we need assurances because we have a role to play in implementing the deal. And many of those assurances were valid assurances, and they had their own concerns as well. They were worried that that the Russians and the Chinese, they did cooperate with Iran during the maximum pressure campaign. Not to a degree that the Iranians wanted, but they did do a lot. And then the Russians were worried, okay, well, now that there's going to be a deal, the Americans and the Europeans want to separate us from the deal, sanction us. So we were cooperating with Iran. Now only they can reap the benefits, let's say, of a deal. So these were the two issues. One was that through the sanctions, the Russians would not be able to implement their obligations in the deal, which were valid. The Russians cooperate with the Iranian nuclear program. The Russians also would be taking away highly enriched uranium. Their ships would have to come to Iranian ports. If they're sanctioned, then those ships won't be able to make it. So, and then the Iranian sent a delegation to Russia to tell them that we don't care what the Europeans and the Americans say. If they sanction you, they sanctioned us and we work with you. They sanction you, we'll still work with you.
Okay.
So the Russians said, we're on board. And that was it. Problem solved. But then the Americans still did not sign the deal. They did not agree to fully implement the deal. The Americans, as I said, the Americans and the Europeans by following the Americans, they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want the Iranians to implement their side. What does they say? They say your rights, my rights are my rights. Your rights are can be negotiated, something like that. So that's what the Americans want, and the Iranians are saying, no, you can't. That era is finished, and you can't do that with Iran. Iran is not Turkey. Iran is not Saudi Arabia. Iran is not Egypt. It's not Pakistan. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a powerful and steadfast and fiercely independent country. The Iranians were cooperating with the Venezuelans when even the Russians and the Chinese were afraid to do so. The Iranians were helping Syria against ISIS and Al-Qaeda even before the Russians and the others agreed to come in. The Iranians are not going to be cheated again after what the Americans did in 2015. So the Iranians said, you either implement the deal in full or there's no deal. And so this is where we are now. So the Americans tried to blame the Russians. The Russians said, no, we're on board. Then they couldn't find any other scapegoat, so it's now the cards. No. The problem is that the Americans have not given adequate assurances because the Iranians, what is the deal for? The Iranians would put caps on elements of its peaceful nuclear program. And then there will be economic normalization. If there's no economic normalization, then there's no reason for the Iranians to put any caps on their peaceful nuclear program. Of course, before you ask your question, it's that I gave you just one example. There are other issues as well. There's a sanctions list. Americans don't want to remove many people and entities from that list. The Iranians are saying you have to remove these people.
And they keep adding more. They keep adding more too.
Yes, but also the thing is that some people who are on the sanctions list, first of all, these sanctions are all illegal.
Yeah.
And many people were added during the Trump time. But if these people aren't removed, first of all, many of them work to help save ordinary people's lives. Many of them made sacrifices. Many of them did it to make money. But in any case, the Iranian government has an obligation to protect them. But second of all, let's say the Iranians agree, oh yeah, we'll just keep all these people that the Americans want on the sanctions list. If the Americans quit the deal again and impose maximum pressure sanctions, and Iran needs equipment for its industries, for food processing, because a lot of this equipment is so-called dual-use technology.
Yeah.
They use that term to basically strangle the people. So, for example, when the Iranians were developing their vaccine, all the equipment was sanctioned. They had to, secretly purchase all sorts of equipment to bring into the country. It was all the Americans knew it. They wanted Iran to suffer. They prevented us from purchasing vaccines. They prevented us from purchasing equipment to make our own vaccines. They sanctioned those institutions that developed vaccines. They prevented Iran from bringing in masks, test kits, That's the United States. That is the reality of the United States. And for those people who think that, wow, how could the United States do that? That's what the United States does all the time.
Does, right? That's not that actually, yeah,
And
that
so do
is
the European allies, by the way. I
standard
mean, as you know, I survived 2 chemical attacks. Those chemical weapons were given to Saddam Hussein by these Western governments.
Mhm.
So for them, it's ordinary. But the point is that these people on the sanctions regime, if they are not removed, then tomorrow when the Americans reimpose sanctions, when Biden decides, to leave the deal, then if Iran asks someone, okay, we need you to go and purchase this equipment for this hospital, people won't do it. Because
right,
say,
of course.
The guy
Why
who
would
used to
you
do
want
it
to put
for
yourself
you,
at risk?
they were sanctioned, you never took care of them. So there are a host of issues. I mean, a lot of issues have been resolved. And we were getting pretty close. As I said, we thought we were almost, but then suddenly the Americans got cold feet because of the pressure coming from opponents of the deal in Washington and so on. But that's where we stand right now.
I'm curious, like this is just speculation, but I'm curious when we know that the lead negotiator, American negotiator, Robert Malley, spent years like hammering out the original deal with Zarif during the Obama administration. And he was pretty passionate about restoring it under Biden. So do you think that the Biden team is just like indifferent or passive? Like, what is it? Because there are some on it who are hawks, when there are other people on it that were obviously placed on it to give a sense of like, yes, we want to return to the deal.
Well, the chief negotiator for the Americans was Kerry at that time. And on the Iranian side, it was Dr. Zarif. But we have to remember that the Iranians and the Americans were not negotiating. The Iranians said, we will not negotiate until the Americans recognize our right to enrich uranium. And then Obama sent him, and then Obama imposed the maximum pressure sanctions were initiated by Obama, by the way,
right.
Not Trump. Trump revived them. So Obama initiated the maximum pressure sanctions in order to make ordinary Iranians suffer as much as possible. Obama called them crippling sanctions, and Trump called them brutal sanctions. So Obama wanted to cripple Iranians, and Trump wanted to brutalize them. Which one is worse? Say it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So, but when Obama imposed the crippling sanctions, the earlier version of the maximum pressure sanctions, Iran didn't budge. And Iran said the Americans have to accept Iran's right as a sovereign country to enrich uranium. And only after the Americans saw that they were getting nowhere did they send a message to Iran through Oman, and then the negotiations began. This was before President Rouhani was elected. So when the new government came in, the process had already begun. And so the new administration continued the negotiations, and then we had the negotiations ultimately led to the JCPOA in 2015. And I was there as well, just like here in Vienna during this 3 months of negotiations. I was also in Vienna during those 3 weeks when the nuclear deal was ultimately signed. Back then, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, I don't believe the Americans ever intended to implement their side of the bargain. And they never did. From day one, they violated the deal. From day one, it was not from day two, not from after 1 month. The Americans from day one began violating the deal. Whereas the Iranians implemented the deal in full immediately. And I was one of those people who thought the Americans would violate the deal. And I said so.
That's true.
Although I'm not an opponent, I was not an opponent of the deal. I was not a fan of the deal either. I thought the deal had serious flaws, and I blamed President Rouhani for it. I've said so publicly many times back then, but it was a deal. It's like, if you sell your car or if you purchase a house, maybe I could have done a better job than you, maybe someone else, or I may have done a worse job. In any case, the house has been bought or the car has been sold. we have a deal. The Americans refused to implement it from day one. And the interesting thing is, and this is something that the Western media and Western think tanks never repeat. I said this on Hard Talk 2-3 months ago when I was in Vienna, BBC Hard Talk, that the Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader, the most important person in Iran when it comes to strategy and the most important person in the decision-making process in the country, not the only person, but the most important person, said that in 2015, during the negotiations, that if the United States is honest in implementing the nuclear deal, in implementing its side of the bargain, in carrying out its obligations, then we can start talking about other issues. But the United States never did that. Obama never did that. So the Iranians, not only did they implement their side of the bargain, they also said to the Americans and Westerners in public, he said this in a speech, that if you show goodwill, then we can talk about other issues. But that's not how the United States works.
Right. Some American officials have expressed concern that it's not just the success of the JCPOA that's so important, but also the failure, which is not because of like a direct American-Iranian confrontation, but because we'll see more, actions and reactions in the Middle East. Iran will be perhaps less inclined to use its leverage over Iraqi resistance factions. They might feel more free to pressure the Americans, who will then be pressured to respond. And at the same time, Israel will feel less restrained to attack Iran, which will also be more inclined to then respond. And then we enter into, a so-called escalatory cycle. And then, you do see Iran's kind of like newfound boldness, like with the strike recently in Erbil. It kind of seemed to set a new precedent, much like the response at al-Assad. And so like just showing that the resistance axis will retaliate, like the Houthis attacking KSA and UAE, for example. So I'm curious, does this sound like a realistic scenario to you?
Well, first of all, we have to separate two things. One is that if we're going to argue that if the Americans are going to argue that the JCPOA is not a good deal, then at least they should first acknowledge that they lied
Are the reason
with regards to its implementation and with regards to American intentions. And Iran was faithful. So whether it's a good deal or a bad deal, in Iran, many people said it was a horrible deal in 2015. It had really angry opponents who said, the Americans they're not going to implement the deal. They're going to, we're limiting ourselves. Our sovereign rights are being trampled upon. And I don't want to get into that debate. I was neither in either camp. I had my own views. I thought there were good things about the deal and bad things about the deal. It could have been a better deal. It could have been worse. I probably would have been tougher at the negotiating table, but I'm not a negotiator. So, and I'm not in charge. So, but in any case, it's a deal. And the negotiators were handicapped by the fact that Mr. Rouhani, did not help them have a strong hand. He kept saying, we need a deal, we don't have money and so on. That's not how you negotiate. If you and I are going to sell a car and I'm speaking to you, you keep saying, sell it. Guy knows that he can get it pretty cheap.
Right.
So, there are a lot of issues that could be discussed. But in any case, put that aside. If the Americans don't want Iran to have drones, if they don't want Iran to have missiles, they should first think about removing their military bases that have surrounded the country. The Americans had something like 40 some bases up to a year ago. I mean, when they left Afghanistan, some of them the numbers lessened, but if anyone who looks at the map, there are all sorts of military bases surrounding Iran, and the Americans have murdered high-ranking Iranian officials in the past, like General Soleimani. So you have a superpower that has nuclear weapons, that has military bases surrounding the country. They've already invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. They're occupying 1/3 of Syria. They've destroyed Libya. Why should Iran trust Americans? So if the Americans are worried about Iran's limited military capabilities, then the Americans have to rethink their, the way in which they've structured their regional security apparatus.
That's a nice diplomatic way to put it.
And if the Americans are concerned about Iranian support for Ansarullah in Yemen, for the people of Yemen, then the Americans should stop the genocide. The Americans, the British, the Canadian regime, the German regime, all these regimes, because sometimes people say, why do you say regime so often? Because they call Iran a regime. I say, well, if Iran's a regime, they have regime. So in my tweets, some of my friends say, God, you don't have to keep writing regime. I say, well, whenever they stop saying regime, I'll stop.
Hey, you gotta, use their words against them.
Yeah. So they help Saudi Arabia and the Emirates carry out genocide, starvation, a starvation scene, something that is unprecedented in contemporary human history. And then they're outraged, by the way, with what Russia does in Ukraine, which is nothing compared to what they did and have continued to do in Yemen. But in any case, if they want Iran not to help the people of Yemen, then they have to stop the war. If they want Iran not to help the Syrians, then they have to stop supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all these extremist groups. I know you've discussed this before. I know your audience is politically aware, but just a brief summary. Biden himself at Harvard University in 2014 admitted that all sorts of weapons were given by US allies to everyone in Syria, including ISIS. Or Jake Sullivan, who's a national security advisor of Biden, said in an email to Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. And we knew that ISIS came from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, ISIS was a breakaway of Al-Qaeda. So the United States, they want Iran not to be in Syria, but they want to destroy Syria.
It's the U.S.
Yeah.
Well, then what you're saying is basically the U.S. wants a completely subjugated region that does not that does not fight back, that doesn't defend itself.
Yeah, and Iran is not, as I said, Iran is not Turkey. Erdogan is NATO. He can pretend that he's something else sometimes, but he's a friend of the apartheid regime. One day he's an ally. We used to like him when he, started speaking out against Israel. Then he's a friend of Israel. One day he's supporting the extremists.
All over the place.
I mean, Iran is not Turkey. Iran's policies are clear.
Yeah.
Iran is not Egypt. Iran is not Saudi Arabia. The Americans have to treat Iran and its allies with respect. And if Iran was a bad actor, then who's the worst actor? If in Yemen, Iran is a bad actor, who's carrying out the starvation? Who's opposing starvation? And if in Yemen, it's really, if the people of Yemen do not support Iran's policies, then why is it that after 7 years of starvation, the capital is in the hands of Ansarullah, or what the Westerners like to call the Houthis? Why is it that Iran, under sanctions, which can only give limited aid, is helping one side, and that side has defeated the other side, a multinational coalition with hundreds of billions of dollars spent, with all sorts of weapons used, yet they still couldn't defeat the people of Yemen. Why? because Iran was on the side of the people. Iran was on the side of the people of Yemen.
That's the big problem with Iran. I think you just explained
Exactly.
exactly why the Americans have like Iran in the crosshairs, because it's not just in Yemen, across the region. The Iranians have partnerships and ally with groups that defend the sovereignty of their territories and of their countries, whether it's Palestinians, whether it's Lebanese, whether it's Syrians, whether it's Yemenis, whether it's in Iraq, and the axis of resistance. And this, this is essentially the US wants a free hand in the region, and Iran is a huge obstacle to that in a very significant way. And that's why it's treated the way it is. But, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I think this is an important topic when it comes to the negotiations. We hear that unlike the American-Iranian talks, the Saudi-Iranian talks are actually going much better and are far more advanced. What can you tell us about these talks? Where are they being held? Who's sitting with whom? And over what are they negotiating?
Well, I don't want to go into too much detail, but what I think the key issue is that the Saudis refused to talk to the Iranians for years because they thought that they could win the war. They thought that by imposing starvation with US aid, the US Navy was a part of this starvation process. They helped the Saudis prevent food and medicine from getting into the country. The UN was with the Saudis because the Saudis used their clout and their wealth to make sure the UN did what they wanted. So the US, Canada, the European Union, Australia, all these countries were working side by shoulder to shoulder with the Saudis and the Emiratis to starve the people of Yemen, and so did Erdogan, by the way. And then until we saw the siege on Qatar, until the divorce, and then they flipped. The same is true with Qatar. Qatar, Turkey were supporting the genocide, just like they were supporting the extremist groups in Syria. And then there was a divorce between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and these countries. And I don't want to explain too much. It's not really the point here, but there was a huge coalition. So the Saudis, for a few years, they had all these countries on their side, including, as I said, Turkey and Qatar, everyone. And they thought they'd win the war, but they couldn't. And they got bogged down. But they wanted a way out where they could win, or at least be seen as winning. So they wanted the Iranians, when they began to start, when they said they want to negotiate with the Iranians, at first it was so that the Iranians would solve their problem for them. And the Iranians told the Saudis, look, we don't negotiate on behalf of Yemen. They're not our proxies. We help them, even though we're sanctioned, and we can't really give them that much help because we're sanctioned, A, and B, because they're surrounded. Just like in Syria, Westerners say Iran sent billions of dollars. The aid that Iran gave to Syria was nothing compared to the money spent by NATO and Arab oil-rich dictatorships and the Israeli regime, and it's nothing. But the issue was, the reason why Syria didn't fall was because Iran's assistance was enough to help prevent the fall of the Syrian state into the hands of these extremist groups carrying the black flag.
Right.
If the Syrian government did not have popular support, and I'm not saying the Syrian government is some utopian state, has many problems, but if it was seen as illegitimate in the eyes of the public of Syria, imagine that huge coalition, NATO, regional countries, all that, and then you only have Iran that side. The Russians, for the first 4 years, they were sort of standing back, giving political support to Iran and Syria, but not getting that much involved. And the Iranians, their military involvement only began Hezbollah in Iran in 2013. Not at the beginning, only after tens of thousands of foreign fighters were already in Syria.
Right.
So the Iranians with it. So the reason why the state didn't collapse was because the public did not want these extremists. Some people loved Assad, some people like Assad, some people did not like him, but they didn't want these extremists.
Don't want to live under ISIS. Yeah.
Yes, or Al Qaeda, or Jaish al-Islam, or all these Ahrar al-Sham, and all these
like
other
little
people.
clones of ISIS, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the state didn't fall because the people didn't want what the Americans were trying to impose on them, what NATO was trying to impose on them, what Saudi Arabia, what Turkey, what Israel were trying to impose on them. The same was true in Yemen. So the Saudis were trying to find a solution where they can have a victory. And the Iranians said, look, these guys, Syria is not our proxy. Hezbollah is not our proxy. It's not like your, like Al Qaeda.
It's not like your proxies. Yeah,
yes, exactly.
They have proxies literally that are actual proxies.
They have literal proxies.
Right. They assume that the other side is like them, where it's not people who are like from those areas who are defending their homelands. It's just proxies that will fall just like theirs do as soon as the funding and arms, dry up.
If Erdogan, for example, today pulls the plug from Al Qaeda and the former, they've changed their name, but we know Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is that's who they were and that's who they are.
Yes.
If they pull the plug, it's over.
Yeah.
If he pulls the plug, it's over.
Yeah.
So these are not Iranian proxies. And the Iranians said, look, we can negotiate with you, we can reestablish ties, we can talk, but we can't. We're not the decider, as Bush would say. We're not the decider.
We're not the decider.
And so that blocked progress. And there were rounds of negotiations with very little progress. But then gradually the Saudis began to see that, this is not going to work. And they need to end the war. And it was only recently when the Ansarullah hit Saudi oil installations really hard, that the Saudis agreed to the ceasefire. And I think that the Americans and the Europeans told the Saudis, you have to end this now. Because the war in Ukraine began, the price of oil had gone up, and they saw that the Patriot missile defense capabilities of the United States were not stopping the drones.
So the only option, it shows you that like the military response from the Houthis actually does have some sort of benefit in terms of getting the Saudis to, like, it's leverage.
Yes. And it's basically what brought about the ceasefire. So the Americans and the Europeans needed a ceasefire badly. The Saudis needed it badly. And now we have a ceasefire. So the Saudis came to the conclusion that, look, if we don't try to end this war, we're going to go bankrupt. Because remember, Saudi Arabia right now is making a lot of money again. And so is Iran, by the way, with these high oil prices. Iran has sold all of its oil, and without any discounts. Iran has no spare capacity, and it doesn't have enough oil for its customers now, thanks to what the sanctions that the Europeans impose on Russia. The same is true with Venezuela.
Yeah.
So the American, by imposing sanctions on Russia, they've increased Russian oil revenue, but they've also made Iran and Venezuela help make a lot of money. But the Saudis are now making a lot of money with these high prices. But the cost of war was huge. And remember, the United States, which it was the sole superpower, they spent trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, in my opinion, had a huge role to play in the decline of the United States. These trillions of dollars have an impact. They wear down a country, the capabilities of a country. So when the United States is spending trillions of dollars and it can't sustain its economy and its global presence as a result, there's no way that Saudi Arabia can continue a war forever, no matter how much oil they have. So the Saudis have begun to recognize, and I'm not saying we're going to have a
big neighborhood block party.
that nothing is for certain, but the Saudis have changed their stance, and the negotiations are making more progress, and the Saudis have changed their position on a host of different issues. I don't want to get into it. I don't know everything, I know I've heard some things, but in any case, it's too early to say what will happen. But the Saudis have become much more realistic. And if the Saudis agree to end the war in Yemen, a lot can be done, even though this will go down in history as the greatest crime of the 21st century.
It'd still be
And
certainly
America
be good for the
and
broader region.
the Canadian Prime Minister is a war criminal. He's committed crimes against humanity. So have British prime ministers. So has the German Chancellor, past and present. The French President, past and present.
Mm-hmm.
All these governments, history will remember them as the greatest criminals of the first half of the 21st century, unless something worse happens. Ukraine is nothing compared to what happened in Yemen. It's nothing. It's horrible. War is horrible. I don't agree with the war in Yemen. I've said this on RT many times every time I've been on RT, I've repeated this.
You mean the war in Ukraine?
The war in Ukraine. I don't agree with the war. Although I do say every time that I blame NATO more than anyone else for expanding eastward and lying about, promising to do otherwise and then lying, the coup, supporting extremists, just like they supported in Syria, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They support Nazis, just like in Ukraine, just like they supported the Contras in Nicaragua and that sort of thing. And of course, the suppression and murder of Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East. Yeah, you know these things better than I. I blame NATO more than I blame anyone else. I don't support the war, but and I say this on RT, and they allow me to come back again and again to their credit. But the war in Ukraine is terrible. All wars are terrible. I do not want to see war in Israel. I want to see the apartheid regime collapse. I want to see, like in South Africa, apartheid to be dismantled and everyone to be able to live side by side. Of course, not like in South Africa where the rich remain rich and the poor remain poor, but racially speaking, at least the regime be dismantled. I don't want war anywhere, but none of the wars that we've seen, whether in Libya, a Western war, whether the war against Iranians and Venezuelans and Cubans and through starvation and siege, the war against, or at least attempt to impose starvation, preventing medicine from going, the war against Afghanistan. None of these wars, even the war in Iraq, compared to what they did in Yemen. That will not be forgotten. But if the war comes to an end, a lot can be done to improve the situation in the region. And the Iranians are more than willing to cooperate to bring about a stable Persian Gulf region. Again, this is sort of like what I told you when Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader, he said that if the Americans show good faith in implementing the nuclear deal, then we can start talking about other issues. The Americans didn't want it. They never implemented the deal, and they never showed good faith. If the Saudis show good faith, history will still be history, but the region can change. So let's see what happens.
Well, on that topic of like broader regional developments in a positive direction, should there be some sort of deal, we've also seen increased cooperation between the Emirates and in Iran, and this started a bit under Trump, but has generally increased under Biden. And some factions in the region attribute this to the Houthis and Iraqi resistance attacks on the UAE, which serve to encourage them, it's one way to put it, to be more cooperative in Yemen and Iraq. Just like Saudi Arabia, hitting the UAE was a very big deal. It's supposed to be this kind of island of stability in like a region that has so much war in it. And once it starts being bombed, that idea of stability goes away, and it can be completely ruinous to their economy. An Emirati intelligence official even sat down with this senior commander in the Iraqi resistance. So I guess all of this is to say, to what do you attribute the improved Emirati-Iranian ties, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, because I think the Emiratis, they know that they're a very small country, and if there's war in the region, the regime would collapse. the Emirates would cease to exist. It's a dot on the map. The Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, these are not real countries. They're small entities. The Emirates has I think a passport holding population of what, a million people?
Maybe less.
The,
I don't even know if it's a
something like
million.
that. In Qatar, it's like 300,000 or
Mhm.
400,000. But and most of the people in the Emirates are foreigners, indentured servants.
Yeah.
Or slaves, like
Foreigners is putting it kindly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But so they began to realize that Yemen is a growing power, militarily speaking, despite the starvation that they impose and all that. And the same is true in Iraq. And the interesting thing, by the way, is a sort of parentheses or a footnote, is that everywhere Iran is so unpopular, like in Iraq, everyone hates Iran. Okay, well, if everyone hates Iran, then you shouldn't have any problems in Iraq. I mean, when I remember when you had these protests against Iran, like before General Soleimani was murdered, the Americans it was on, like you'd have a couple of hundred people in Karbala or a few hundred people in Baghdad, and they were saying the people are protesting against
right,
Iran.
it's all it
And
takes.
these were basically people who worked for NGOs, Western-funded NGOs. Okay, you had these hundreds of people on the streets, and then you'd have the Western media making a big thing out of it. When General Soleimani was murdered, you had millions on the street in Karbala, in Baghdad, and Najaf, and then you had millions in Iran. So it's always Iran is unpopular. People hate Iran. Iranians hate the regime. It's falling up. And there's always this paradox, because on the one hand, it's an unpopular regime. It's hated universally, but it's also a growing threat. I mean, if it's unpopular and it's corrupt and it's falling apart.
Everything all at the same time.
It's everything at the same time. So, it's like, you're dying on the one hand, but you're an imminent threat. I mean, right. But that's just how it is, because it's Iran. So, and the same is true in Iraq. The same is true. So, they repeat all these narratives, and then they believe their own propaganda, and then they impose policy based upon these narratives that they created, and they're always wondering, why don't we get the results that we're looking for? It's sort of like again with Russia. I was just in Russia. I just came back this morning. I was in Kazan and Tatarstan for 4 days, and I'm no Russian expert, and I didn't visit the whole country, but it was obvious, and I had no minders, and there were people were supporting the Russian government. They were supporting, again, I don't support war. I don't support the war in Ukraine. But again, I think the Americans pushed Ukraine towards war. And in any case, I'm sure you've gone, I know you've gone, I've seen some of your fantastic shows, and I don't want to go into debates that you've already discussed in detail before. But in Kazan, you could tell that the economic situation, from what people were telling me and from what I saw, is much better than what's happening in parts of Europe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the ruble has stayed, shockingly, to the shock of many, has even become stronger. Interestingly enough.
The Americans and the Europeans, they say, yeah, we'll bring, we'll turn. I think Biden said they're turning the ruble is being turned into rubble in the first phase. Well, their miscalculations are based on their own narratives. We'll bring them down. We're the West. And they believe their own nonsense. So they impose sanctions before thinking about it. Well, maybe these sanctions will hurt us more than them. Maybe we're not as powerful as we think we are.
Mm-hmm.
So,
meanwhile, I just wanted to note. I mean, we talked a bit about Yemen, and we also have to mention the Americans are also starving Afghanistan right now. I believe there's the horror stories that we're reading from Afghanistan that no one seems to care about. I mean, every major mainstream media outlet was in Afghanistan a few months ago when the Americans finally withdrew, because they wanted the Americans to stay forever. And then suddenly they all left, and then no one's talking about it anymore. But the Americans like have seized the assets of the Afghan central bank. People are like selling their organs or are selling their children.
Worse than that. It's worse than that.
It's absolutely horrendous. And we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. Like, it's like none of these crimes matter. None of these crimes matter. I mean, when you say that what's happening in Ukraine, as horrible as it is nothing compared to what Western countries are still doing right now in places like Yemen and Afghanistan, like, that is no joke. It is.
No Western journalists who are talking about Ukraine day and night, it's because they're hypocrites. Every single one. Every single one of them are hypocrites. Every single one of them. They know there's starvation in Afghanistan, and they know that their governments have imposed it. They've stolen the assets of Afghanistan by sanctioning the government. Iran doesn't like the Taliban. I don't like the Taliban. But the Taliban is a reality. In fact, the Taliban, when the Americans were supporting the Taliban and the groups that led to the creation of the Taliban in the 1980s and the 1990s, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, then we had 9/11. We all know it was blowback. The Taliban, when they took the country, they killed Iranians, and they killed Persian speakers, they killed Shias, they massacred people. This was in the 1990s. So Iran there's no law, and the Taliban, they were an extremist group. The Iranians hated them. The Iranians don't like the Taliban now. But the Iranians continued to speak with the Taliban because the Iranians knew that the Taliban is a part of Afghanistan. Significant parts of Afghanistan are influenced by the Taliban. They're influenced by, and the Taliban, a lot of the extremism of the Taliban is linked to decades of religious education coming from Saudi Arabia with the support of the United States. Mm-hmm. The United States created this extremism. Just like they're doing in the Ukraine, allowing these extremists to thrive, and they think there won't be blowback. Well, let's see.
We'll see what happens in 10 years.
When the economy declines in Europe, and then you have all these refugees, and you have all these people who will lose their jobs, and then you have these Nazis speaking about racial supremacy, then we'll see what happens. But so with the American, remember the extremists in Afghanistan, their textbooks were published in the United States.
Yep.
I think
that the Washington Post reported that. I mean, it's not like, we're not just saying that. It's actually reported by mainstream media.
If someone says this is all conspiracy theory, I understand, because it's so extraordinary.
It's so convoluted and disgusting and shocking.
But the Iranians recognize that for whatever reason, thanks to the Americans and the Saudis and those in NATO and the British and the Emiratis who supported these extremist groups in the 1980s and the 1990s, they exist. So the Iranians said, we have to deal with this reality.
Yeah.
And so now the only country that is sending fuel into Afghanistan, sending wheat or grains into Afghanistan, is Iran. So we're the bad guys. Let's look at the map and see who's doing what. So the starvation of Afghanistan, you're absolutely correct. If we remove Yemen, let's say there was no genocide in Yemen, there was no war. Let's say Yemen didn't exist. After Yemen, the second greatest crime of our time is Afghanistan.
Yeah.
As we speak. It's also Syria because right now they're starving Syria too. They're starving Syrians, and they're stealing. The Americans are stealing their oil. The Turks are leading the financial support for Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. Syria, that's also, it's difficult to say which is worse. But I'd say at the moment, the starvation in Afghanistan is, after what's happening in Yemen, is the greatest crime. but no one cares. I mean, these mainstream Western journalists, when Biden decided to confiscate that $7 billion and then give half of it to victims of 9/11.
Makes no sense. I mean, just
it's theft. But 9/11, the victims of 9/11 are the people of Afghanistan more than anyone else, who are victims of American policy in that country. So you go and steal the money of the Afghan people for blowback that was caused by your own coalition with Saudi Arabia, creating these extremists in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the people who actually carried out the attacks none of them were from Afghanistan. You know, it's just mind-boggling.
And it really is.
Like, it's so obvious. And then when I talk about these things with mainstream Western journalists, and I speak to lots of them in private, they will never argue against me. But they'll say, oh, the Iranians are doing this or that. Oh, let's say we're doing all the things that you say we are.
Still doesn't add up to what you're doing.
All the nonsense that you say we're doing. It's nothing compared to what you're doing. So yeah. Well, and what the thing that they like to say is that these are bad policy decisions, or
like it's just the intention behind them is
exactly. Yeah,
just like
exactly.
unintended.
Just like saying, Hitler bad policy.
Yeah, it actually is. It's like, no, that is actually intention.
Yeah,
bad policy decisions.
Yeah, bad policy.
I mean, that it actually is. That's what they're saying, is that absurd. But Mohammad, while I still have you, because I know that you are very busy and I've already taken a lot of your time, I want to make sure there's a couple things I want to make sure I get to. I wanted to get your take on what recently took place. I know it just happened and we still don't know the full details, but there was this recent assassination of an IRGC officer in Tehran. I think it was like a drive-by shooting, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, there's a lot of speculation. This could have been the Israelis, the Mossad, it could have been the MEK. What's your take on this? And then on top of that, like, this has also happened just a few, I don't know if it was a week, days, but it was recent that there was this announcement of a joint U.S.-Israeli military drill where, like, the U.S. was practicing refueling Israeli jets to go, Israeli fighter jets to go, like, bomb Iran. At least that's what the Israeli media was claiming. So given this announcement, how do you interpret that announcement? And in light of what just happened with this IRGC officer, what do you think is going on here?
Well, Israelis do all sorts of crimes. They're killing Palestinians literally on a daily basis. Children, reporters, teenagers, women, doesn't matter. And no one in the Western media will, you don't see any mainstream Western journalists tweeting these things. It's all in Ukraine. Then they bomb Syria regularly. Just 2-3 days ago, they bombed Syria, and who did they kill? 3 soldiers who were manning an anti-aircraft or missile defense system. So people who are not attacking Israel, people who are protecting the population, they murdered them. Anyone in the West complain? No, Israel can do whatever it wants. It can occupy, it can murder, just like Turkey or Erdogan can do it. It's fine as long as they're doing it. As long as they're doing it for us, or they're on our side. So, and then of course the MEK that you mentioned, the MEK is a terrorist organization that fought for Saddam Hussein. They were actually foot soldiers of Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. They fought against their own country, Iran. They had a military base in Iraq. They were trained by Saddam Hussein, used against Iran, and they killed thousands of Iranians. I have a personal experience that I've said earlier elsewhere. That I think it was 1981. I think I once mistakenly said 1982. I think it was 1981. I was getting ready to go to school. I was a high school student and living somewhere near central Tehran. And a bomb exploded. Almost all our windows were shattered. And either 9 or 11 people, I don't remember, were killed in that bomb attack. It was near Shariati Street, near I know you don't know that, but in case there's some Iranians who are listening, Talagani Shariati, near that area, near the Eshat Abad area, neighborhood, in that neighborhood, 9 or 11 people were killed, including an Armenian family, a husband and wife who were taking their 2 kids to school. That was MEK. So not only did they fight alongside Saddam Hussein, they were carrying out bomb attacks and assassinations and suicide attacks, like ISIS. They would carry out suicide attacks on public figures in I think, Yazd, in Tabriz, in Kermanshah, and somewhere else. In any case, that's the sort of people who we're dealing with. Where is the MEK now? They're in Albania. They're based in a NATO country. Thousands of them are in a camp there. And then they have offices across Europe and the United States. So these countries, you know, they're harboring terrorists. They're funding these terrorists. They're waging war against Iran. NATO is waging war against Iran, like they're waging war against many countries, but Iran is one of them. So they can do all these things when it comes to Iran. The Israelis often use the MEK to carry out intelligence operations in Iran and assassinations. So NATO is supporting Israel in these attacks. It's the logistical support. All these, you know, Western embassies in Iran, they're involved. Western embassies and military bases in neighboring countries, they're involved. So it's this Western war and regional proxies working together against Iran. When you take that into consideration, actually Iran has done a very good job. It's like 40-1. Iran has done actually a fantastic job. Some say this is a major security loss. No, I think it's actually very surprising that they can't do much more.
Mm-hmm.
And the Israeli regime, we've seen how in recent weeks all these attacks have been carried out inside the 1967 borders.
Right. Way more. Yeah, there's way more attacks inside Israel than.
So, you know, they're not exactly in some ideal position, but it's quite possible, therefore, that the Israelis did this, and with NATO support, as I explained. This officer was a part of the Quds forces. He wasn't, he was a mid-ranking officer. And where is the Quds force? What are they doing? Basically, they're supporting the Syrians against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they're supporting the Palestinians against ethnic cleansing and colonization. So whoever is opposed to that, fine.
Yeah,
that's who they are.
That says a lot. Yeah.
Supports that. That's how you can. That tells me who that person is.
That tells a lot about someone's character.
Yeah, exactly. That says a lot. So I was actually on Arabi television right before I came here. I was at a studio. And this is a TV program funded by Qatar. Mm-hmm. My understanding is based in London. So I was on a show. It was in Arabic. I spoke, but it was what I said was translated. Like the guests were like saying, yes, the Iranians are spreading drugs throughout. It's so funny. I was laughing throughout the show. I probably never smiled so much.
Really? But was it the Iranian? Usually I hear that Hezbollah is the one spreading the drugs to Latin America.
Exactly. That's what I said.
Hezbollah is the Iranian. Yeah, I'm sorry. I haven't heard the Iranians are the ones.
It was the Hezbollah, but they were saying the Hezbollah is spreading drugs across. Iran is spreading drugs across the region and across the world. And it's like one of those, what's it called? That comedy,
The Onion, SNL.
Evil, no, like this evil guy who wants to take the world, and it's sort of like a comedy thing. Austin
Powers. I don't even.
Yes, know. Exactly. Very good.
Like Dr. Evil. Dr. Evil.
Yeah, it's the Dr. Evil sort of stuff, and I was laughing the whole time. Ridiculous things that they say about Iran. But in any case, so I mean, these people who it's amazing what the Arabic public is being fed.
Oh yeah,
but, of course. Many are way too smart to be fooled by this nonsense. But in any case, that's what the Guards are doing. They're supporting Syria against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They supported Iraq against Al-Qaeda, and they're supporting the Palestinians against ethnic cleansing and murder and colonization and apartheid, and they're supporting Yemen against genocide. So if that's a bad thing, yeah, that's and then if that's a bad thing, I think that they should then assassinate me as well, because
Oh God.
I support every single one of these policies across the region.
Well, there you have it, an invitation.
Yeah,
well,
so
there's one last thing I want to ask you about, and it's not a simple.
So they murdered a family man.
They murdered a family man.
They murdered a family man who was protecting people against Western extremism.
I mean, they murdered. That's the organization Qasem Soleimani was in charge of, and that's who the Americans murdered.
Newsweek, the cover of Newsweek had a picture of General Soleimani, and it said that he's crushing ISIS.
Right.
Americans were not crushing ISIS, though. They were supporting ISIS up to a point. And the reason why they changed policy is complicated. We don't have time for that. You know it as well as I, what happened and so on. But he was crushing these groups. And then later on, the Americans, when they murdered him, they said he was about to attack American embassies. And only recently, I think it was just a few days ago, the US, I think former US Secretary of Defense, a senior, you could also find that, he said that, I tweeted it, but I don't remember who it was, that he said that, there was no real evidence of that. So the Americans, they did just murder, assassinate, and then the Western media will mimic whatever they say.
Yeah, they act like it never happened. They act like it never happened.
Well, they'll just repeat Western government policy and pretend that they're independent. But so just they killed the person who saved Iraq from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who saved Baghdad and Erbil, and who saved
the person
Syria,
who cleaned up America's messes, actually. That way too.
And who saved Syria alongside the Syrian army and alongside Hezbollah and alongside later on the Russians. All these and
all of the bad guys alongside all of the bad guys. So bizarre. Yeah. All of the bad guys are getting together.
Alongside the Hashashabi and those who lost their lives, Iraqis who lost their lives. So they murdered. So if he's a bad guy, well, then I
guess so are all of them. There's one last thing I wanted to ask you about, and that is an issue related to the PKK in the region. I'm curious if you could maybe discuss that just a little bit, because on the one hand, Iran has fought the PKK on its own borders. On the other hand, Iran and its allies in Iraq seem to cooperate with the PKK, both in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Sinjar. Well, then in northeast Syria, the PKK has become an ally of Western imperialism, which you alluded to earlier in terms of, occupying basically Syrian oil fields, the most fertile land in Syria, in coordination with the Americans, and essentially making it impossible for the Syrian government to access its own oil or its own wheat reserves. So could you just, very briefly, I guess as an ending topic, discuss the PKK in the region and its contradictions?
No, Iran doesn't support the PKK, and the PKK is active in areas where the Americans have a presence, whether it's in Iraq and whether it's in Syria. And Mr. Barzani, who is an Arabian, and he's the dictator in control of that part of Iraq, if he wants to stop the PKK, and if the Americans want to stop the PKK, they can do it tomorrow. But the problem is that the Americans are always playing a double game. Mm-hmm. In Syria, on the one hand, they work with the Turks against the Syrians and support extremist groups, and then elsewhere, they're working against the Turks with the PKK or with allies of the PKK. In Iran, the Americans play very dirty. In Iraq itself, the reason why we have all these tensions in Iraq began during the US occupation, when they were playing off one sect against the other. The Americans use everyone against everyone else. So if the PKK is a problem, let's look and see where this group is based. And when have you seen the PKK attack American interests? Never. Have point. The PKK ever attacked Barzani and his interests? Never. So the American, it's like it's like Hezbollah on drugs. You have to delegitimize Hezbollah. So yeah, the Hezbollah, they're doing drugs all over the world. It's not the Americans, it's not anyone, it's Hezbollah.
Yeah, the CIA has never trafficked drugs or used drug money for anything.
So the Americans sanctioned the people of Lebanon, and then their people steal everyone's money from the central bank. All the oligarchs are their friends and allies, right, in Lebanon. And then what is their criticism of Hezbollah? Forget the drugs thing. They say Hezbollah, they're allies with who? Nabi Berri. Yeah. Okay, so Nabi Berri is a bad guy, right? If between right now, you and me, you're in Lebanon, right? If tonight, Hezbollah says we will end our relationship with Hamas, what do you think will happen to Nabi Berri tomorrow? He will have an invitation from the U.S. Embassy.
I mean, he already does get invitations from the U.S. Embassy.
No.
Like the Americans are friends with him too. Yeah.
That aside, the very same NGOs who are all anti-corruption and all that, they will be saying, "Oh, he's changing.
He's great.
He in the past
he's reforming.
But he had to do this and that, and the majority of Shia, they support Hezbollah. He was in a tight spot, and everyone is doing corruption in Lebanon. We have to be real. Everything will change. What they want is to separate Amal from Hezbollah so that they can have some sort of civil war in Lebanon.
Yeah.
Amal, of course, is much smaller than Hezbollah, but then they would help Amal.
Then you'd have Shias. Then you have Shias killing each other.
And then you would have, Jaja, and then the Israelis going. So, when the Americans and these NGOs in Lebanon, who are absolutely corrupt, very corrupt people, they're getting their money from foreign embassies, and these NGOs who are talking about revolution, let's see whose side they take. Are they going to take sides with 14th of March billionaires or not? And those, of course, the 14th of March, they're cooperating with Nabi Berri. Nabi Berri will become the Speaker of Parliament, and you will see who votes for him. But the point is that their criticism, they want to say that Hezbollah is corrupt. They're the corrupt ones. They know the only clean group is Hezbollah. They sanction a whole segment of the Lebanese population, and by extension, the whole of the country, to crush Hezbollah. So they crush a nation. Their allies are all corrupt. Their allies have been in charge of the economy for decades. And then they blame the victim. Just like in Gaza, just like in Yemen. I remember when during the war, and you'd see these Western reports about how the government in Sana'a, the so-called Houthis or Ansarullah, how they're not allowing this woman reporter to report this or that. It's like blaming the victim everywhere. It's always like these are the bad guys. It's not the Saudis who are massacring the population. It's not like in Lebanon where you have all these billionaire oligarchs who are allied to the United States. It's not like that's just how it works. So it's either the Iranians who are supporting terror, what's it called, PKK, or it's the Iranians who are spreading drugs and across the world. Or it's Hezbollah who's sending drugs to Latin America, or okay.
On that note, I want to thank you so much. I know that you fit this into what is a very busy schedule. So I really, really, really appreciate you coming on and breaking all this down for us. Again, Mohammad Marandi, Professor of English, Literature, and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.